we're good to go? All right, well, welcome to the 1 Week Endorsement Interview. This is just to help us decide who we're going to endorse. We don't guarantee either of you equal time. We'll ask questions to you both. In some cases, we're okay with you asking each other questions. Just to get this started, we kind of like you to introduce yourself for a couple minutes, just a brief biography, including your work history, civic involvement, and why you want this job. So,
should I look at you all or look there?
You can look at us as well.
Okay. And what is your name?
Sophie.
Sophie?
Yeah,
Nice
we've
to meet
spoken
you.
before, I think.
Yes. Okay. I'm Shana Maxey Pomerantz. I am 48, identify she, her pronouns. I'm Black and Jewish. I am a third generation Oregonian, born and raised in California. I've also lived and taught in the Bay Area, New York City. Went to law school at Southern University Law Center, which is a historically Black university in Louisiana. Spent the majority of my professional life as an educator, working either in schools, after school programs, or nonprofit organizations that serve community and youth. And primarily have worked in communities of color, low socioeconomic, and dealt with issues of violence prevention, literacy, poverty, things of those nature. Currently, I serve as the executive director of Race Talks, which is an organization that's educational and community-based. We're in our 14th year of programming and typically offer 11 months of programming to community folks. I've also worked as a civil rights investigator with BOLI, which folks know about that, and was a Writing Center director at Concordia University, and also chief of staff for Diego Hernandez. So, stop there.
Have you run for office before?
First time. I've sat on some commissions, so I'm considered a public figure in that sense, but not an elected person.
Can you tell us why this office at this moment in time?
Yeah, so I've been deeply, deeply concerned based on what's going on in this country right now, especially with the rolling back of civil rights that have taken generations to put in place. And my family has been very active in civil rights work around voting rights, around women's rights, around civil rights. And so, and specifically the work we do with Race Talks does fall under the purview of DEI in most instances. And so looking out and seeing that in some instances my work is being banned, and also things that I taught in the classroom, our history, I might be arrested depending on, which state and what laws are being enacted. So it's deeply concerning, and just my own experience with BOLI. I entered late when I was approached about running. I was in the midst of starting my lawsuit with BOLI. We ended up settling and just continuing to see this unfold before my eyes in real time. And I said, I don't see anybody running talking about civil rights in a way that has deep meaning for me. And so I put my name out there, and now we're talking about it. It's out here. We both agree we need to elevate the civil rights unit. And so I'm glad that this is on the table and it's being discussed.
Great. Same question?
Yeah, same question.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Growing up, I had a very diverse set of parents. My father was very conservative. He was a Colonel of the Air Force Reserves, the senior vice president of a commercial insurance company here actually in Portland. My mother, on the other hand, was about as progressive as it gets. She, as a young age, after she got sober, she would take me to protests as a child. I often protested the Iran-Contra scandal as a kid, and I'll just be very candid here. You hate going to protest as a child. That's not what you want to be doing. As you're in Southern California being yelled at that you're a communist. It's a very conservative area in Southern California at the time. At the same time, in the other breath, I would be with my dad. And the first political event that I ever went to, I was in my Boy Scout uniform, and I went to a fundraiser for Dan Quayle in downtown Portland. Let's not laugh about Dan Quayle here.
Your Boy Scout uniform.
Yeah, I know it's very silly. And for the longest time, my claim to fame was that I almost shook the hand of the vice president, as a child growing up. And there was this interesting moment in my youth where my mother would protest nuclear weapons and get arrested at the Nevada nuclear test sites, and I was just perplexed that she would count her arrests because eventually it moved up to a felony. This was a very interesting moment where she was saying, like, why do you do this? It was like, well, I believe with less nuclear weapons we can make the world safer. I would talk to my dad, and different family household, and he was like, no, I believe we need nuclear weapons to keep our world safe. And these are people you love deeply and dearly, and they're going about the same pursuit, just in different ways. And that has been a very interesting moment in my childhood, which has really developed in the way that in my leadership style in the legislature. As I developed through, I struggled in high school. I didn't graduate on time. I had to take summer classes to graduate. When I went into college, I didn't graduate on time either. I actually would have probably flunked out, but I caught mono. And so I was able to medically withdraw, and I did what most normal people do at that point. I went to Walt Disney World and became a Jungle Cruise skipper.
A what?
A Jungle Cruise skipper.
What's that?
I told you, do you remember the movie with The Rock? He was like a Jungle Cruise. It was called the Jungle Cruise. That is actually a real ride at Walt Disney World. I watched that with my son.
What years were you a skipper?
1999. I was actually, I told jokes that were my own jokes, which you're not supposed to do. I was subsequently let go from that job.
Fired is Jungle Cruise.
And Nigel, to be clear, I'm eligible for rehire. Okay. And to be honest, it seems really silly, right? You're 19 years old at that point in my life. It was a very pivotal period for me because at that point I did not believe I could graduate a single class in community college. And I started back at community college, and I went to 3 classes. I got 3 C's, and then I found a professor that inspired me, and I started to build one step at a time in my own personal life. Went back to Western Oregon University, which was the site of my earlier failure, eventually graduated, went to law school after that, and was able to, got my first 4.0 in community college. And then getting out of law school, I knew that I wanted to be in the area where I live right now, which is the Corvallis area. The quality of life there is absolutely unbelievable, and obviously I'm a Beaver fan. And so in that space, and in my legal practice at that point in time, there was a case that I had where the law had been written incorrectly. And I found myself as a lawyer partnering with, at the time was Representative, he was a Republican, Andy Olson, working to change a law on background checks. And I found meaning in that. And so in 2010, I then ran for the state senate at that time. It was a somewhat contested seat, and I lost that race. It was an incredibly important experience for me personally. And then in 2014, I kept working as an attorney. The attorney work that I do is on behalf of consumers. I got into civil rights cases, denial of medical treatment in jails, get into foodborne illness cases against larger companies, as well as medical cases against large insurance companies, all on behalf of individuals and consumers. I then moved into the legislative space in 2014. I was extremely fortunate as a first-year legislator to have a gavel in a Ways and Means subcommittee in natural resources. A year later, I moved into co-chairing the Public Safety Subcommittee on Ways and Means, and a year after that was the co-chair of the Human Services Subcommittee. That year, we worked to establish basically the way that we currently fund our Medicaid program, our hospital provider tax. That year was one of the work groups that I was on and worked to get that done that year. The following biennia for the next 3.5 years.
How do you feel about the hospital provider tax? It's kind of a scam. Well, I shouldn't have answered that.
Yeah. But anybody who's read or understands anything about that has some concerns about the way that it's currently operated. I think the interesting challenge as we think about nationwide, this is a model nationwide that states are basing how they fund healthcare off of. And so there is, it was part of that conversation, we sat there and said to ourselves, what if the federal government just sits there and says no more? Right? It would impact, and I can't remember the number, but I think it's almost all 50 states. Most states have more than one provider tax. We have two. And people are always looking to add on others to draw down those dollars. So it is, I think the spirit that the federal government, when they set it up, was the right spirit, which was to incentivize and compensate people who for the Medicaid programs. But outside of that, the way it is implemented, and if you want my honest, candid opinion, I think the way that some of the Medicaid dollars get shuffled out, I don't think Medicaid dollars should be used for campaign finance contributions. And the way that it's currently set up and the way with some of our CCOs, that's exactly what goes on. And it is, you can't sit there and say it's this direct tie, but if you look at it, it kind of is in that way. But it is currently the system that America has decided that they're funding their healthcare on.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so in just kind of, I'll be a little bit shorter to conclude. I spent those years as Ways and Means co-chair, which is probably one of the best jobs in the legislature. Nobody knows who you are, but you are in some of the most meaningful conversations I think you can have as a legislator, and it's also a place where you get to work on issues in a fairly bipartisan way, where it's not always in a partisan manner. And then the last 2 years I spent as Speaker of the Oregon House, where I worked on, I think we passed one of the most proactive reproductive health bills. We have one of the most significant economic investment packages with the CHIPS Act here in Oregon, as well as we continued some of our largest housing investments and policies during that period. And I would say is we passed campaign finance reform and also ranked choice voting, which I'm a big fan of. So I think that's a little bit of my background.
Just quickly, again, why AG's office and why now?
Absolutely. I really do believe if you think about the biggest issues that we're facing right now, there's very few places that you can have an impact on those issues. So you think about housing and homelessness, and I would love to talk about how the AG's office can tie to that. But there are actually ways, and how quickly money gets out the door in the contract review processes where fingers are getting pointed right now. You think about behavioral health and substance abuse. I really believe that with the right leadership of the Attorney General's office, it is right at that nexus and can be an indispensable partner in some of the greatest issues that we're facing, but also at the same time there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to help struggling Oregonians to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities in life. And I think about expanding our civil enforcement division on direct on the ground help for people in consumer protection cases, also creating a working families unit where we're really attacking those issues where we think about wage theft, partnering with Bureau of Labor and Industries, moving in worker misclassification, child labor violations. There's a whole host of areas where and this is done in other states. I would love to say that these are wonderful Dan ideas, but these are looking at different models in other states that are working to help, kind of working family Oregonians that I get excited about. So I think there's some nuances where we can really dig in. This is just that one space where I believe you can have that impact.
I just want to ask you both one question. So first of all, do you want to add anything to what you hope to achieve kind of when you're in office?
Yeah, also I just wanted to say we share a lot of similarities. I didn't know. So I also, dropping out of college and actually got pregnant, and abortion is extremely important. I experienced it, and so I'm glad that Oregon is a place where it's protected, but ended up re-enrolling, working full-time, also have been fired from jobs, so I feel like it's a rite of passage. You get fired, you're like, I'll be fired from somewhere much better than you, so don't worry. But, not Disneyland though, if not, that's a good one. But anyway, what do I hope to achieve? I think because a lot of my work has been more community-based, when we talk about politics, most people are really confused about it. When I worked in the legislature, a lot of times people thought they were going to their federal electeds when really it was a city or county person that they needed to connect with. And so we ended up establishing an annual program called Engaging Democracy, where we ended up bringing in BIPOC staffers from each state of government, level of government, to help inform the public. You know, what does each level of government do? How do you access? Granted, if you call your federal representative or senator, they're going to they'll do a warm passover, and that's fine. And it's sometimes necessary, depending on what your need is. But I would like to see the AG's office get more broader community engagement in terms of helping the community to even understand what does the AG's office do. And I think I was becoming more engaged just from looking around the country at what various AGs are doing and the way that we are all becoming engaged in the work of the AG's office. And so I think from what I hope to achieve if elected, I think again, you know, looking at, just based on my own experience as a state employee, coming, you know, sitting across the table from the DOJ in an adversarial way, looking at where the DOJ can have more of an advisory role when conflicts arise within these state agencies, to help curb the need for litigation and costly trials and settlements. You know, I'm a huge proponent of mediation, conflict resolution. That's something we've got in common. And I think wherever there's an opportunity to engage on that level, it's a major component of our Race Talks work. You know, how do you sit down and have the uncomfortable conversations? I saw someone characterize my words as an arbiter, and I think it's more as an advisor. You know, I think an arbiter, there could be some conflicts there, and so looking at if you need to have a third-party mediator or arbiter come in to help resolve these disputes, where possible, you know, let's do it. But I think that's just talking with some folks in different agencies, feeling like, yes, if the DOJ's office was more accessible, that would be huge. And even had a chance to talk with Ellen Rosenblum. I always like to talk to the person who holds the job or held the job to find out, what am I stepping into, and ask, you know, is this something that would like to be done? And I think shifting the billable hour structure is something that's been attempted before, and so it's one of those things of great idea, maybe wrong time, or maybe there's another way to look at it. And so I think when you're stepping into a job that's held by somebody for 12 years, coming in with the approach of, you know, I'm going to clean house and take a battle axe, no. That is not how you do it. You step in, you look around, you say, what's going on? It's a very large office. I think doing an internal survey audit, external survey audit in terms of how it's engaging with the agencies it serves, and determining how we can make some tweaks to it. So I think that would be something I hope to achieve. And then looking at how can we further engage with law enforcement and community-based advocates, you know, when we're talking about sentencing. You know, when I taught in the Bronx in New York City, Khalif Browder is a name that made national news. And Khalif Browder was somebody who was detained and arrested under suspicion of stealing a bag, getting on the train. Well, he was the younger brother of one of my students. And so when you have those kinds of stories where there's a deep impact felt to people you know personally, and I have a lot of those stories, unfortunately, the reality is that you start thinking about criminalization very differently. And so I think in terms of working with DAs, working with localized approach to supporting DAs, supporting law enforcement and community-based advocates who often feel ignored, as well as public defenders. We have a public defender program that really needs to be looked at and questioned as to why it's not being funded. And so part of the role of the AG is to offer advisement to the governor and to the legislature about good policy. Then that is definitely an area I think that has to be looked at. I already mentioned the community-based approach. I think, I've served on a number of community-based advisory bodies. I think they're extremely effective. Being able to, one, give community-based boots on the ground feedback into how is the work that you're doing actually being received out in community. Because I think a lot of times once you're in the building, so to speak, whether it's the halls of the legislature, the AG's office, governor's office, you're kind of closed off and you're very insulated to kind of what you hear and what people are feeding to you. And so I think having an opportunity to receive information from stakeholders all over the state, Portland is the loudest bark in this fight, if you will, but the reality is Oregon's a big state and everybody is dealing with houselessness, drugs, crime, and guns. And so I think, taking a holistic approach in terms of how the AG's office can be more expansive and accessible to our voters, I think that's very important.
Representative Rayfield, kind of just to build off that. So how would you assess the performance of the current AG?
I think it is one of the things when you run for this job, and I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is you don't run for Attorney General thinking that your job is going to have to be defending against national attacks to a lot of the values here in Oregon. So I think of some of the environmental attacks. There have been attacks in other states regarding reproductive health. The Attorney General's, while you have a responsibility to protect the values in here, you also have, it ripples out into other states with the case law precedent that you set. And so there is an obligation to look forward. I don't think the current Attorney General thought when she was running that a lot of the latter part of her tenure was going to be in this shadow of protecting. And so her focus has been very, what I would say is nationally oriented on protecting Oregon's values, right? Which I think you have to do. What I would like to do, and I think there's some low-hanging fruit, is focus a little bit on the agency itself. I'm a hands-on individual. That's the way I plan to do it. I love the practice of law. There's a lot of things within the agency that resonate with me very personally. So those things that I'm very excited about. I think she brings up a really good point and something we've been talking about together, which is how do you partner with criminal justice reform advocates as well as law enforcement and bridge that gap that currently exists to where we think about there are some amazing cutting edge things that are going on even in Gresham right now when it comes to modernizing policing using data for stolen vehicles, which reduces the amount of stops and the efficacy to reduce crime. So those are the type of things I think you can use to bridge those gaps and expand those things, really focusing internally within the state, as well as where I would really like to emphasize. There are, like we talked about, expanding the consumer protection arena is something that I would like to improve upon. I would like to build upon our environmental work here in this state. You have a small division that was built under Attorney General Kroger. I think that can be expanded. That does need legislative help. That would be a general funded program.
Can you give us an example of something that the current AG's office is not doing in consumer protection that you'd like to do?
So what I would say, one of the big things that goes on right now is there are a ton of, the legislature will pass a ton of laws, and what ends up happening is, say, the Attorney General should enforce these laws. What is known out in the world is that the Attorney General's office does not have the enforcement, the capacity to enforce all of these laws. What I would like to do is expand the workforce to target certain areas that we want to focus on. So for instance, working families. Now you have to do that in a way that isn't going to put a strain on the general fund. And so you have the thing called the Consumer Protection and Education Fund, which is basically a place where you do the big settlement. A lot of the big settlement money goes into that fund. That then can be used to fund frontline DOJ investigators as well as staff if it meets the parameters of the statute. What often happens right now is there isn't as much partnership with the legislature. So as you bring in these settlements, sometimes the DOJ will actually articulate specific things that they want in the settlement. They say, hey, we would like this money, 50% of it to go to sidewalks, 25% of it to go to electric vehicles, another 25% is going to go in the Consumer Protection and Education Fund. I would like to have more collaboration with the executive branch as well as the legislature as we have larger settlements to then start funding the frontline work of this consumer protection work for all of these statutes that we're not enforcing, and then
Is
be
there a
able to
lot of money
impact them.
sitting in those settlement funds?
Often what happens every 2 years, the legislature looks at that and says, hey, how much money of this can we take to sweep to go to other purposes? And so that is a big component of how that works.
And the Attorney General's not been successful in protecting those funds against a sweep, or is she not able to do that?
I think what's going on is people have looked at it. They've said, okay, this is the amount of money. From a legislative and an accounting perspective, you say you need this amount of reserves, right, to be able to. You want to be able to have a squish of 4 months overhead, or 6 months at the end of a biennia. And so often what we will do is we will take off the top and give the remaining amounts back. What I would like to do is change that in the way that we're structuring some of our settlements, because some of the settlement money right now is not going directly into that. So we just had to pass a law in the short session about how we are going to allocate the wonderful job that the current Attorney General did with the Monsanto case. We got one of the best awards in the nation. So it's like $700 million plus. But again, that money is not going, most of that I don't believe is going into the Consumer Protection HQ.
Are you comfortable with the amount of money or the amount of work that the DOJ currently contracts out to third-party law firms, outside law firms?
That's one of the things that I want to look into. It's easy to cast a judgment right here on my list of to-dos when you go in is review the process for when work is hired outside, when work is kept in-house. There are advantages sometimes and necessary things to move outside, but then there's also times to reevaluate, can you actually save the state money by keeping work in-house? So for instance, we have a lot of securities litigation. Is it more advantageous, especially when you look at the risk and the cost to pursue the litigation? Is it better to have it in-house or out of the house? I can't sit here today and tell you what the right answer is, but it is something that I want to look into. I also want to make sure that when we're having our request for productions process for law firms that want to do this work, that it is open and transparent, so that people can actually see why the firms are being chosen, what strategic advantage that they bring to the table, and so that there isn't any sniff of impropriety in those decisions.
I'd like to answer some of these too. You rapid fired over him, so I'd like to interject. So there were a couple of questions that came up, so I'm going to try to go backwards. So the question was third-party law firms. I dealt with that personally as the plaintiff employee. So when there was the investigation that occurred with Carol Johnson and I, that was with the third-party law firm. And the problem there was that Boley hired them, I think it was $150,000, to do what was later to be revealed a very inadequate investigation. That's highly problematic, especially if the agency is relying on, actual investigation, fact-finding, and especially if it's going to get into the media and be reported on, because now we have a situation of high-level embarrassment, not just for Boley that spent all that money, taxpayers who feel like, what are you wasting our money for if it's not going to be accurately done, but also the individuals who put their names on the investigation and their reputation, I think there's also an issue. I was talking with some folks who are public defenders and looking at the consortia arrangement. So if we're going to be recriminalizing people, we need to have a sufficient amount of attorneys that people can be represented by. If you have attorneys that are not having some sort of supervision, the quality of defense is impacted. So you come down with the hammer of the DOJ or the hammer of the DA's office that's prosecuting, and then where's the representation there for the person who is drug addicted or involved with crime? And again, because of the work that I have done over the years, I know that generally that person is not isolated in terms of just being a criminal or a drug addict. There are other issues at play in terms of housing. There's children involved. Most likely there's family, there's community. And so looking at all of these elements are extremely important. There was another question, I think, around the budget. And again, I think, having had an opportunity to talk to Attorney General Rosenblum, one of the things, just going back to the billable hours component, I believe it's I get confused with acronyms. The Legislative Finance
Fiscal Office.
Thank you. I always get confused with acronyms. There's so many of them. She said, you might have some problems with them, And so one of the things I asked her was, but if it makes good fiscal sense, and eventually if you're looking from a preventative standpoint of saving money down where maybe you need to spend a little more on the front end, I don't know, Dan, you would know better than me in terms of, is there a preventative legal budget set up for each agency? But I would dare say if not, it probably should be there. I know they tried to bring in a flat fee before. Now it's hourly. I don't even know if that's the right approach. I mean, I know that DOJ needs to make its money, but I think we have to figure out what also makes sense. If your job is to ultimately provide legal guidance, advice, and representation to all these agencies, to our state, then we can't create barriers that make that possible. So I think looking at that more closely, one of the things I was very happy to know, like when you get voted into the legislature, there's an onboarding process, right? So you generally go through some training, the electeds, their staff, it's really great, so you don't come into the building cold. And so I asked Ellen, I said, so is there an onboarding process for the AG? What's the practical, what is my first 30, 60, 100 days looking like? And she said, well, John Kroger had coffee with me. I said, well, I reached out to him too, and he didn't want to talk to me because he says I don't do partisan politics. So I said, okay. She said, but we had a cup of coffee, but she said, we are, very actively working, and yes, there is an onboarding, and whomever is elected, I am here and available to help with this transition, which I think is very gracious, to ensure that there is a seamless transfer over, because there's over 1,300 people that work in that office, and probably have a lot of concerns about whomever is coming in. Do they still have a job? Are they, going to be there? So, and what happens to the work that they're already working on? So those are some things that I'm already thinking ahead to. And also thinking about, Dan, to your point about the outside impact or forces that threaten. We're in a very different time. That's just the reality. And we saw that in 2016. I mean, you have a certain level of disregard for our Constitution. There's a level of lawlessness that's happening right now. And so the reality is that, we just had Keith Ellison here, AG for Minnesota. There is a plan afoot already of the AGs working together to figure out best and worst case scenarios. And so I do acknowledge that while the AG's role is to focus on what's happening within the state borders, the reality is there's a lot of things happening nationally. And so building up this united front is something that's already been happening and already is in the works and moving forward. So whomever steps into this office will be stepping into the role and responsibility of that work continuing as well.
Rep. Rayfield, you mentioned low-hanging fruit. I'm just trying to get a better sense.
Yeah, please.
It sounds like you want to shift the focus away from kind of a national focus to something more local, more consumer protection. Can you just give me us a few more specific examples of what you would do differently?
Yeah, and again, I don't think it is shift away. You have to sit there and protect Oregon's values against national threats. So, for instance, we have right now, there's about, I think it's 17 or 18 Republican attorney generals that are attacking California for the way that they are setting pollution controls on their vehicles lower than the EPA standards. That has the impact in how we are going to deal with climate change. So you can't just abandon that. So I just want to be really clear, that has to be done, and the current Attorney General has done a really good job with that. I think that focus and that effort gives whoever is successful in the fall the ability to then come in and deliver on a different set of initiatives. One of those is expanding that civil enforcement division, which is where you would house, say, a working families unit. Again, when I'm my time in the legislature, I would often talk about the values that you want to pursue, and those values then are driven or attacked through various different legislation. It's the same way that you can do that as an attorney general. So when you focus on climate change, there are ways that you can pursue polluters in different ways to really hit towards that value. So that is why I say I would like to expand the work that is being done with the folks doing the environmental protection work. There is the creation of a working families union that is really driven around a value set, and the Attorney General has a set of tools to utilize to then make the place that we live in, right, what we want it to look like. So that is just in your civil enforcement side. You move into the what I would call like building safer communities, right? That's the partnering with law enforcement. That's the working with criminal justice reform advocates, where we start working on programs, taking these, like I mentioned in Gresham, what is a incredible program that other agencies outside of the state want to replicate. We should be doing more of that and looking to do that and using the soapbox of the Attorney General to then move through that. There are opportunities right now. The current Attorney General, I think due to different constraints of resources, went away from actually partnering and working on what I would say is with local district attorneys. That's where most of the prosecution is done, with drug cartels and drug delivery. So in my area, the Attorney General's office used to be a resource when they were doing wiretaps. That resource isn't available right now, and that's something that I think we can bring back online.
Why is it not available?
My impression, and this is something you'd have to ask the current Attorney General, my impression is it is resource constrained. So as we've had various vacancies in DA's offices, they call it the CJD, the Criminal Justice Division, has had less resources to be able to go and do some of those things. So you start cocooning in to do the vital services that you need to do. So when you have a DA out, the DOJ has to go out and be the DA in that county. And we've had some unprecedented DAs that have been not appointed for a really long time. So that has been a strain on those folks. I think there's what I would say is improving systems and outcomes is something that I'm very interested in doing. Shana brought up the incredibly important topic of how do you fund the Department of Justice. And so I'll leave it there, but that is a really ripe area that needs to be looked at. In the private world, what we have is what we call dispute resolution programs, early resolution pilot programs. There are ways that you can actually reduce costs, respect the integrity of folks, because you are the defense attorney for the state in those places. One thing that we don't want to acknowledge, but sometimes agencies do not always follow the advice of the Department of Justice. That is a reality that we live with. What I believe needs to happen is better channels between the Department of Justice and the executive branch. Now, the DOJ does not have the ability to say, OHA, you're doing it wrong. I have the power to change what you're doing. No, you are the attorney for that agency. The appropriate channel is to have open lines of communication going to the executive branch, i.e. the governor, who then can address those issues to mitigate what I would say is exposure from agencies not following the advice of DOJ.
Wait, I'm trying to parse this a little bit. Are you saying
please.
there's situations right now where the governor is not doing a good job of telling her agencies to follow the advice?
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, sorry.
What I'm saying is there are situations right now where agencies may not follow the advice of the Department of Justice, right? So what you need to, and the Department of Justice does not have the authority to compel an agency to follow a line of a decision process. So just like in my private practice, right, I tell my clients, I'm going to provide you the best advice. Sometimes I may provide a recommendation, but it is always your decision on how you proceed. It's very similar with the Department of Justice. So in that dynamic, the person who is ultimately the client is the governor's office. So as we see what I would say risk or exposure issues due to someone may not following, we need to have better lines of communication with the governor's office. And I would like to explore what those lines of communication.
So just give me an example of how that's happening right now, where the agency's not following the advice.
Yeah, so you could look at, I want to try to think, I'm sure you could probably go back and look at many of your different articles. Shana could probably provide some examples as well. I'll give you a good example of something, let's say I'm just going to make something up. This is not factually specific to give you an example of something, because so for instance, OHA, let's say they were reviewing a certain grant contract that they wanted to move forward, right? And they're looking at it, they've got a pot of money that they're allocating out. They in a contract review process, DOJ might give some certain analysis of this is, how you should proceed. OHA might look at that and say, no, we're going to do it anyway, and we're going to, award this grant. right? So it could be as simple as that. It could be more extensive on how to handle litigation. So for instance, you're in the middle of a litigation and there's a settlement offer on the table. DOJ says we should take this settlement offer and not go to trial and risk a higher verdict. The agency might say under those circumstances, no, we would like to move forward because maybe there are a host of issues within that agency where they feel that they need to move forward. However, with DAS risk as well as the agency involved, and then what you would need to do is have the DOJ, if they disagreed with that, have a line of communication with the governor's office. So there's a multitude of ways in which you can create exposure and risk, and so I would like to evaluate that process. I think that there is a room for improvement. One of the other things is in the private world, we examine claims data. Insurance companies are for-profit industries. What the value of examining and aggregating claims data is you get to see risk. Now, we don't have the level of claims data that, say, these large insurance companies do have, but I think it would be really interesting to partner with DAS Risk, provide reports to agencies where the exposure is, so long-term we can save taxpayer dollars, and ultimately, as the state, we are serving our citizens, and how can we do that better? So I think those are kind of, when I think about improving systems and process, that's where the Attorney General can really step in, I think, and convene, examine, see if there's things. Housing and homelessness. I teased that earlier on and nobody took the bait. But one of the things that we do right now is contracts are being moved back and forth to get money out the door. You all have probably heard the numerous complaints from entities where it's taking a long time to get money from the state into people's hands. Behind the scenes, what's going on is people are pointing fingers. You'll see you'll have the Department of Justice saying, hey, we're not getting what we need to be able to approve these contracts. On the other side, people are saying, no, the DOJ is being too slow. It doesn't matter what the answer is. What I'd like to do is take another set, and this has been looked at, but I'd like to look at it again and figure out what are the barriers, why is it taking so slow, and how can we improve this process? Again, you're at a nexus to hopefully convene a better outcome in that role. And then the other thing I think that I really want to do is be more active and proactive on the solutions that we have on the table. So when I talk about consumer protection, there are a lot of things out there. I think we have a good set of tools that we can use to help consumers, but sometimes you'll see this. We don't always have the tools that we need to help people. And so I want to use the soapbox of the Attorney General's office to lead on certain solutions, some of those being community corrections. We dump a lot of state money to counties without outcomes. We need to be looking at best practices as we're thinking about how do you reduce recidivism, especially when recidivism is in the past, I think in the last 2 years, I haven't looked at the most recent report, but we were one of our all-time high here in Oregon. It was unacceptable. So I really want to look at how do you standardize some of that stuff where the taxpayers are getting their dollars. And again, this is a place where you can use your soapbox to really convene conversations, which is a little bit off of the day-to-day role of running an executive agency. So.
Shannon, just real fast, I want to give you a chance. Is there a specific, let's say, factual example of where DOJ is doing something that you think is not?
Again, I draw upon my own personal experience interfacing with the DOJ and the adversarial role, and always want to look ahead to see how could that have gone about how could that have gone better? And so in my assessment, I feel like the scope that the AG's office has actually is a little cumbersome in its ability to advise and work with agencies. And that's something that, in terms of, looking at legislative changes, talking to the governor, that's some of that policy advisement that needs to be looked at. As our state is expanding, we have a lot of people coming in, our government needs to expand as well in terms of its ability to support the work. So to speak to, if the only time the AG's office is able to come in is when asked, but you see a problem, going back to the model of being the attorney, if I am on retainer for you and it's my job to protect your interests, your money, your safety, your freedom, and make sure you make good decisions, and I see you out here making bad decisions, and I just sit there and say, well, you never called me. I couldn't move until you called me. And so that is problematic. And so creating an opportunity where it can be more proactive. I would even say, in terms of the oversight, if part of the consumer protection is also protecting us, the people, that pay into this. And so we talk about employees, employers, we talk about protecting families and wages, but the state of Oregon is the largest employer, and so we have to make sure we're walking our talk. And so that means that part of the role of the AG is making sure, even though we are defending, I personally have a feeling that my stance, my personal stance is, if you as an agency are doing something and you are legally advised that that is not okay and you do it anyway, I personally have some type of feeling about representing your defense, the costly defense that's paid for by taxpayer money, when you did the exact opposite. There's got to be some other kind of steps that are employed here. I know that there's conflicts issues, and so I think looking at that more, if we're going to expand the role of how the AG's office is able to engage, and part of that barrier, I'm told by some agencies, are the billable hours. As Dan referenced, there are some agencies that just don't even reach out at all. And so I think it's not one of those apply in every circumstance. This is where I'm looking at it to say, do we see a pattern here? And maybe it's a pilot program. Maybe it's a recommendation in this particular area, as opposed to just a wide sweeping approach. And so I think, again, because there's been 12 years under one particular form of leadership, which has had some opportunity to make some tweaks and get some things right. And even in talking with Ellen, it's like, yeah, I think this is a good time to look at evaluation and to see, where can things be tightened, where are there opportunities for shifts. I would say within the first year, that would be the goal. Within the next few years, let's see where there's pilot program opportunities, how can we shift and adjust, filling in those spaces where there is no DAs in these areas. We were asked a question just the other night with the Urban League, creating a pipeline program for more attorneys. We know we have a public defender problem. We know that we only have, 2 law schools here? Is it 3? So, where's the opportunity to create more pipelines into government to help have people come in? So I'll pause there, but yeah, that would be
Well,
something.
we're running out of time, so I just wanted to ask you another. So you appear to not be a member of the Oregon State Bar.
That's correct.
Why not?
It's yet. I'm not yet.
Okay, so
It's a very
in the
difficult.
process.
It's a difficult test. I already told you about my TBI. It's a hard test, and if you're not a good standardized test taker,
So you've taken the test?
I've taken it twice.
Well,
and-
Ron Wyden failed it 3 times.
Listen, most
Yeah.
of the judges I love here have taken it 4 or 5 times. That is just the reality. I passed law school. I did really well. I argued in front of the Louisiana appellate by myself. The nice thing I will say about attending an HBCU law school, it's a 3-day bar in Louisiana, and they teach you every single part of the law, because the idea is once you come out, and especially recognizing that things like the bar and the LSAT were established once Black people started entering into the practice of law, and so knowing that there's already going to be some hoops that are going to make it difficult for you to step. We don't want no issues. You know how to write your memos, you know how to write your briefs, you don't have a law clerk or a paralegal doing that for you, and so you're prepared to step out, and the language is you're prepared to hang your own shingle. And so the reality is that we have a shortage of lawyers. I mean, we have a lot of lawyers here, but a lot of them work in firms and they work in government. We don't have a lot of, in the case of civil rights, and the issues that come up in BOLI, a lot of them end up going into lawsuits because there's some issues in investigating the issues that are being reported on, and employment and housing issues. And so people get frustrated and they say, BOLI's not going to do anything about it. And then they go and hire an attorney, and there's maybe a handful of attorneys. And right now they are so inundated. 3 of them worked with me and Carol on our case. And so looking at the fact that, there needs to be more supports. And so I think however we can support more attorneys to come in to do this work, I think it's important. I think everybody should do their time in government personally. That's my personal philosophy. I think you learn a lot about democracy, you learn a lot about serving the public, the inner workings of how government even operates, but we don't create that as something that is expected as part of civic engagement. As a former high school humanities teacher, if I could say, hey, all of my high schoolers would have spent some time working in a DOJ office as an intern or a law office, you learn a lot, and a lot of those things are applicable to real life, everyday experiences. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I feel like I'm hogging this.
No, not at all. I do think we have just about enough time to have each of you ask each other a question. Unless, Nigel, do you have anything else? If you would like to ask your question.
Why do you think you'll be a good AG?
Yeah, I mean, I think
You can ask me that question back if you like.
I think that if you look, the things I think that make me unique in this role is just the diversity of experiences. 18 years in civil litigation, having managed a law firm practice in that world, having been in the courtroom in smaller litigation, but then also larger litigation.
Can you also talk about your criminal history?
Oh yeah. Oh no. I was. That's actually part of what I want to talk about. The other. I'll save that. We'll use as a teaser. The other thing for me is I think that is I spent 9 years building a reputation in the legislature as being someone who deals openly, fairly, someone that focuses on trust, strong relationships, and still trying to effectuate a vision of the state that we all want to live in. In that leadership style, in being Speaker, having managed a branch of government, co-managed with the Senate President, with a budget of more than 400 employees. I think it was more than $400 million within the last legislatively approved budget. That gives you a unique set of experiences to be able to move forward in that environment. And I think it's a collective life experience from the diversity of my parents. I think when we talk about legal experience, exactly. I have seen the courtroom as a defendant. I have been a prosecutor when I clerked in law school. I have represented defendants, and I have pursued cases, whether they're civil rights cases, common negligence cases, all the way up to more like a mesothelioma case. So it's a very diverse set of experiences in that legal realm personally, with your parents, your personal life, that I think, I wouldn't be sitting here today if I didn't get 5, 6, 7 chances.
Did you say you've been a defendant in a criminal case?
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
Oh yeah. So I left that. That's normally a part of the spiel where I say I didn't graduate high school on time, and I have been arrested multiple times. I think 4 times, I think, as my memory serves, throughout my youth. It was a very difficult period. And
what were you arrested for?
So that started, I believe, when I was 17. Criminal mischief, reckless endangerment. Then shortly after that, there was another DUI. I think I was 18 at that time. Then I think there was another reckless criminal mischief after that. That was while I was at Western. I went back and I got to do a.
That was while you were at Western?
Yeah, while I was at
You
Western.
were drinking in the only dry county in the state. And you right?
No.
It's still dry.
No. That was we're mixing my criminal record here.
Oh.
You had 17 was the reckless endangerment, criminal mischief. Then got a DUI when I was 18. I was right before Western, so it was in that summer before going to Western Oregon University. When I was at Western before I left, there was any other criminal mischief within that area, and then there was in Corvallis when I think I was 20. You're not supposed to shoot BB guns inside the city limits. That is apparently so. There you have it. So those were the kind of my experiences, kind of moving back and forth in life.
Did you do jail time?
I have been in jail, yes. So.
How long were you there?
just for the days there. So most of my stuff was done through a civil compromise. There was a diversion, multiple diversions in those instances. I think go ahead.
No, I'm about to ask you to finish and ask your opponent a question, but if you want to wrap that up.
Oh yeah, no, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Do you have a question for your opponent?
What's been the most rewarding thing about running for office?
The idea you're going to ask each other a challenging question.
I'm not playing into your
Fine,
premise.
okay.
I'm not going to play into your premise.
I think that's a realistic question. I think, you know, the interesting part about running for office is that, you know, I've been asked to run for office quite a few times. I think when you show up in community and you are an advocate and you speak the hard truths and you engage in the difficult conversations but you do it with a smile and, you know, with pleasantry, and you're not cussing people out and getting irate and everything. People say, hey, you know, you're making good sense, and you're able to bring people to the table and talk about the difficult things and still find commonality and leave with a handshake or a hug. And I think that's how I was raised. You know, my family, especially here in Oregon, has always been involved in community. You know, when you own a grocery store, a community store, and a barber shop, you know, you eat because the community patrons your business. If you don't give good customer service, you don't eat. And so I started working there when I was 9. And so sweeping floors, and it was kind of a joke when I came back to Oregon after law school and I was looking for work, and I said, can I get my old job back? Because it's still there at the grocery store in the old Albina community. But I think what's part of what I've been trying to do in the course of running, because I am in community, I have been informing people about this process. And a lot of people think, you know, it's very easy. And so realizing, you know, the deadlines, the cost to it, the interview process, preparing your mind around questions, not knowing really who the people are that you are challenging in these races, and how to do it in a way that's respectful, but recognizing where the line of difference is, recognizing where we share commonality is okay. It's okay to acknowledge that, but also recognizing the diversity. And so I think anytime I've done something, I feel like I bring my whole community with me into it, because now people start looking at me and saying, well, if Shana could do it, you know, maybe I can do it. You know, if Shana is somebody who feels pretty, you know, grounded and, you know, I live in a working class community. I'm a renter. I own a 13-year-old, 15-year-old car that's kind of falling apart. I'm a normal person. You know, I buy secondhand clothes. That's part of my commitment to the environment. And so people kind of look at my decision making and my life path and say, okay, well, you know, I didn't really think I could do that. Maybe I can. And so I graduated from law school at 40, so I don't have years of tenure, but I'm grown, and I've been out here living as a Black Jewish woman for 48 years, and I'm also generationally tied into this country in terms of civic engagement, in terms of the things that have been impacting us as a country. And so from all the states I've lived in, from Epps, Alabama, population 300, living and working as a farmer, to, you know, working in the Bronx and living in Brooklyn, growing up in Oakland, you know, protesting. I have also a lot of diverse experiences, and I just didn't get caught for my foolishness. And I don't know your mama, but my mama made it very clear. My mother used to come up to my school. I went to Berkeley High School, population 3,500. You could smoke weed and cut class at school. And my sophomore year, I decided I was going to elect not to go to classes. And I had a semester with 50 unexcused absences. And I would share this story with my high schoolers that I taught and said, my mom got, you know, that was back in the day when you had voice machines that you could erase over, and when it says your student wasn't in school, and have your friend call, okay, I just need you to talk for 2.5 seconds to, you know, talk over Some of y'all might be too young to remember this. But anyway, when my mom got the actual letter saying I have 50 unexcused absences, she said, well, clearly I have failed you as a parent because I go to work and put food on the table, and your job is to go to school and get this education, and clearly you have decided not to do your job, so that means maybe I don't need to do my job. So maybe you need to find somewhere else to live because this is not working out anymore. And that was a big wake-up call for me. And even when I went to college, she said, you cannot stay at home. You need to go at least 100 miles away from home, and you need to go to an HBCU for at least 2 years. And that was a challenge. My dad was not in favor of it. He wanted me to go to community college. This was at a time when the community college experience was not what it is now. Now you are dealing with high-level professors. You get a quality education at a community college. At that time, if you were a black girl or a student of color and you go into a community college, you might not graduate. That's just the reality. And so my stepdad was a strong proponent of me going to an HBCU and going to a 4-year institute, because as a black man, he was a dean of students at Carleton College, and I have 4 parents who all had higher education. That's not usual. And so pushing my education was very important. And so that's what I also see that I bring here.
So we're really out of time. We have
Yeah,
2 questions.
we're long-winded. We already
So,
decided that.
the other side, can you each share with us the one organizational endorsement you've received for this campaign that you're most proud of? Dan, sorry.
I made my mistake yesterday. When he asked me this question yesterday, I said the Oregonian, and then he said, well, we can't print that. And so I stayed with the Oregonian just for some fun, just to tease a little bit. You know, if I were, I mean, I think about the 2, like the Planned Parenthood, Oregon Lake Conservation Voters. Those are 2 endorsements that, like, through my work in the legislature, like you earned those through hard work.
Okay.
Right?
I entered it March 12th. Most of Dan's endorsements came in November, and so I will say that everyone I have talked to said, I endorsed him because I didn't know you were running. I said, I didn't know I was running either. So hopefully you'll be my first, maybe my second. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, I'm in it, I'm here, and me and the best person win, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Great. So the last question is a somewhat silly one. We ask of all candidates. And the question is, if a movie were made about your life,
Yeah.
who would you like to star as you?
I was thinking of who are the light-skinned actresses out here. I want to go with Tessa Thompson. I think she's physically, we got full faces, and she's got that silly, serious demeanor that I have.
I would unquestionably pick my son. So.
Haven't we had this
That's
before?
disqualifying.
Didn't we have this before?
Okay, you gotta pick
Somebody
a
else said the son, and we wouldn't
Not
allow
my
that.
son. Like, it would be good.
It's gotta be a grown-up.
Talk to
adult-
him.
the
Like,
adult
he'll
you.
tell you here, like, let's see here. Oh, Steve Carell. He's hilarious. I love Steve Carell.
Although you very much stronger resemble to Will Forte.
Who? Oh, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah.
I would have.
That's true.
The other one would have been Will Ferrell. Those are.
Thank you all for your time. So we're going to
Thank
take
you.
still photos. If you exit through this door, there's a photographer waiting there just to snap a photo, so you can have a good photo.
Someone else said their son.